So today we are going to talk about hypoglycemia. So what is hypoglycemia? As you know, probably hypoglycemia refers to low blood glucose, but hypoglycemia by definition is signs and symptoms induced by low blood glucose concentrations. But signs and symptoms are not specific to hypoglycemia, and low blood glucose, again, how low should low be is not well defined. So, why is hypoglycemia dangerous, or why should we bother about hypoglycemia at all? I'm sorry. So, glucose is the sole metabolic fuel for the brain in physiological conditions, and therefore the brain requires a constant supply of glucose. In starvation, brain can also use ketone bodies as a source of fuel, but for that to occur, the ketone levels should have to be really high, and that does not happen suddenly. That requires prolonged starvation. So under most conditions, brain will require a constant supply of glucose, and a deficiency of glucose can cause loss of consciousness, seizures, and coma or even death. Additionally, hypoglycemia can also precipitate fatal cardiac arrhythmias. So these are the two reasons why we are very worried about hypoglycemia. So a little bit of physiology about hypoglycemia. We know that glucose can mostly come from the food, but in the fasting state, if we are not consuming food, the sources of glucose are either glycogen. It is released from glycogen by a process called glycogenolysis, and these stores in a normal person can last up to 8 hours. Additionally, new glucose can be synthesized from other metabolites such as fatty acids or amino acids, and that is called gluconeogenesis. And after 8 hours, the dominant source of glucose is the gluconeogenesis. So what hormones are involved in the pathophysiology of hypoglycemia? As you know, insulin is the hormone which reduces the blood glucose levels. It increases the uptake in peripheral tissues and reduces the levels in the blood. On the other hand, hormones such as glucagon and epinephrine tend to increase the glucose levels. And if you look at the organs or the sources of glucose influx, oral intake is the main source of glucose influx, but in the fasting state, it is the liver which does most of the glycogenolysis and the gluconeogenesis. Additionally, kidney can also perform some amount of gluconeogenesis. And if you look at the glucose efflux, brain is the dominant glucose consuming organ in the body. 50% of the glucose that the body produces is consumed by the brain. But at other times, the muscles, the fat can also take up glucose for exercise or for creation of more fat, and the liver can take up the extra glucose again for making fats or storing as glycogen, etc. So hypoglycemia will occur if there is a mismatch between the efflux and the influx. If the efflux becomes greater than the influx, the blood glucose levels are going to fall. So how do these hormones affect the glycogenolysis or gluconeogenesis? So insulin will reduce the glycogenolysis in the liver as well as the gluconeogenesis. It will also reduce the gluconeogenesis in the kidneys. And at the same time, it will increase the glucose utilization by other tissues such as muscle, fat, and liver. Glucagon, on the other hand, will increase both glycogenolysis as well as gluconeogenesis in the liver. It doesn't have much actions elsewhere. And epinephrine will tend to increase both the liver glycogenolysis and gluconeogenesis, also the kidney gluconeogenesis, and it will reduce the glucose uptake by other tissues. So in a normal person, when a blood glucose begins to fall, the following physiologic responses will occur. The first thing to occur is a decrease in the insulin secretion, and that will occur roughly at a glucose level of 80 to 85 milligrams per dl. The second response will occur around the blood glucose of 65 to 70, and that is an increase in glucagon levels. and glucagon will try to increase the blood glucose. Then the third response, which occurs especially if the glucagon response is not proper, is the epinephrine response, which again will act as we discussed. And apart from that, cortisol and growth hormone also have a permissive action, although they are not themselves critical for this response. So this is a diagram showing how things work. You have a decreased glucose. The beta cells sense the decreased glucose and reduce the insulin secretion out here. The decreased insulin secretion is sensed by the alpha cell. The alpha cell cannot sense the glucose directly. What it senses is the change in the insulin secretion. So if the insulin levels fall in the islet cells in the pancreas, the alpha cells know that it is time to secrete glucagon. So they will secrete glucagon. Both decreased insulin as well as increased glucagon will cause increased glycogenolysis and gluconeogenesis in the liver. At the same time, the decreased glucose is picked up by the central nervous system, and it causes an increase in sympathoadrenal outflow, and the resultant stimulation by through epinephrine will cause an increase in blood glucose by number one, lowering the glucose uptake in the muscles, kidney, and fat, and providing all these precursors for gluconeogenesis in the liver. And epinephrine also, it will stimulate the gluconeogenesis as we discussed. And further, these symptoms will push the person to ingest carbohydrate, and all these together will lead to increased blood glucose. So basically, we have three defenses against hypoglycemia. Number one is decrease in insulin secretion. Number two is increase in glucagon secretion. And number three is increase in epinephrine secretion. So now we come to clinical hypoglycemia. So as we were talking about the Whipple's triad, Whipple's triad is the one which is we use to diagnose hypoglycemia because the cutoffs are not clear. And what the Whipple's triad is made up of is three things: symptoms or signs consistent with hypoglycemia. That is the first point. Second point is a low reliably measured plasma glucose concentration. So the plasma glucose concentration should be clearly low, and it should have been reliably measured. And what I mean by that, I will be telling in the next slides. Further, most important, resolution of symptoms or signs after the plasma glucose concentration is raised. So all these three have to occur. Patient has to have hypoglycemic symptoms. There has to have a low blood plasma glucose. And once you correct that glucose in the same episode, there should be a resolution of these symptoms and signs. Only then we say that the triad is complete. And a complete triad is almost diagnostic of a hypoglycemia. So why do we say Whipple's triad, and why not just use a blood glucose cutoff to say hypoglycemia? Number one, as we said, symptoms are not specific. You can have similar symptoms with other conditions also. Number two, glucose threshold for symptoms is dynamic. Somebody who is having recurrent hypoglycemia will have symptoms at a lower blood glucose. Somebody who is having chronic hyperglycemia may have similar symptoms at a higher blood glucose. Number three, you can get an artifactually low blood glucose, and this can occur because of pre-analytical problems. Especially the glucometers that we use, they are not built to detect low blood glucose, they are built to detect high blood glucose. So they do not work well at subphysiological glucose levels. And further, when you do a glucometer test, you are taking the whole blood from the finger, and if you take the actual plasma glucose, it is actually higher. So the whole blood glucose is 50% lower. So you get a lower value on your glucometer than the actual blood glucose at all times. So these are the reasons why we use a triad to be sure rather than going for a cutoff. So what are these symptoms of hypoglycemia about which we have been talking? So broadly, the symptoms are divided into neurogenic symptoms and neuroglycopenic symptoms. So the neurogenic symptoms are autonomic symptoms. They are caused by sympathoadrenal discharge, whereas the neuroglycopenic symptoms are because of deprivation of glucose in the brain. So the neurogenic symptoms are palpitation, tremor, anxiety or arousal. These top three are caused by the sympathetic system, that is through the epinephrine secretion. And sweating, hunger and paresthesias are cholinergic. They are related to acetylcholine secretion. So all these are autonomic symptoms, whereas the neuroglycopenic symptoms are feeling of warmth or weakness, difficulty in thinking, feeling confused, feeling of tiredness or drowsiness, difficulty in speaking, blurred vision, and CCD which is a short for convulsions, coma, and death. The signs of hypoglycemia are pallor, diaphoresis. You can have tachycardia and increase in BP, and sometimes you can observe the neuroglycopenic manifestations such as seizures. And this study was done in which they tried to block the autonomic symptoms and then isolate the neurogenic from the neuroglycopenic symptoms. So as you see in the EU or the euglycemic person, there are no symptoms. Then hypoglycemic persons, you've got this. This is the level of symptoms that they're having. They have blocked the adrenergic pathway by ADB, which is the panel. And again, there has been a decline in the number of symptoms, which would probably be mediated through the adrenergic pathway. And then they did a total autonomic blockade, and now you're only left with the neuroglycopenic symptoms. So neuroglycopenic symptoms constitute a smaller percentage as compared to the neurogenic symptoms, because neurogenic symptoms will occur at a relatively higher blood glucose, and they sort of defend the body against going into neuroglycopenia. So this is the reason why it is much less common as compared to the neurogenic symptoms. So now we come to the causes of hypoglycemia. Causes are broadly divided into two categories. One, causes in ill or medicated individuals, and the second one, causes in seemingly well individuals. But this is a more of a theoretical or a difficult to do in practice kind of classification. The reason for that is majority of hypoglycemia that we see in practice occurs in diabetic patients. So practical classification, considering the rarity of hypoglycemia without diabetes and certain unique pathophysiological features of diabetes, is hypoglycemia in patients with diabetes, which is very common, and hypoglycemia in patients without diabetes, which is very rare. So hypoglycemia in diabetes is a common problem. It is an important barrier to achievement of euglycemia. Because of hypoglycemia, we are not able to give a very aggressive regimen. Hypoglycemia predisposes the patient to recurrent hypoglycemia, which has its own problems. And hypoglycemia is a source of morbidity and mortality for the patient. So how common is hypoglycemia in diabetes? So hypoglycemia is much more common in type 1 diabetes. And type 1 diabetes patients on an average can experience up to 2 episodes of symptomatic hypoglycemia per week. And they may have 1 episode of severe hypoglycemia, that is one requiring assistance by somebody else, per year. On the contrary, type 2 diabetes tends to have very less hypoglycemia, especially in the early years when the insulin secretion is preserved. So this diagram is showing the natural history of type 2 diabetes. So as you can see, look at the purple curve out here. This is the normal insulin secretion. In a normal person, it is normal, but when the person gradually begins to have impaired glucose tolerance, you see how the curve rises. So this is the phase in which insulin levels are very high and the blood glucose is maintained at normal through the high insulin levels. Then once the insulin levels begin to fall slightly from the peak, then type 2 diabetes sets in. And in the early phases of type 2 diabetes, still the insulin levels continue to remain high. But as the diabetes goes on and on, the insulin levels gradually begin to fall and patient goes into a beta cell failure. So in the later parts of type 2 diabetes, insulin secretion can become really low. And this is the time when generally most patients require some amount of insulin to maintain glycemic status. And it is at this point when the beta cells have failed that the type 2 diabetes patients also begin to have frequent hypoglycemias. So as they progress to insulin deficiency, the hypo risk increases in type 2 diabetes and it becomes almost similar to type 1 diabetes at that point of time. Overall, type 1 diabetes has 3 times more hypoglycemia than type 2 diabetes. But because type 2 is 20 times more common than type 1, therefore, most of cases that you will see with hypoglycemia will be type 2 diabetes. The definitions of hypoglycemia in diabetes are slightly different. The definition which is commonly used is all episodes of abnormally low plasma glucose that expose the individual to potential harm. This definition is relatively broader. It also includes asymptomatic episodes. However, it is difficult to define a plasma glucose concentration that categorically defines hypoglycemia even in diabetics. However, one cutoff is mentioned. It is said that patients should become concerned about the possibility of developing hypoglycemia when the self-monitored plasma glucose is becomes 70 milligrams per DL or less. When we say self-monitored, we mean a glucometer value. And because glucometer value is actually lower than the actual value, so what this means is that in a normal person around 80 milligram per DL, you have the responses against hypoglycemia, the insulin levels begin to fall. So that will correlate roughly with the 70 milligrams value done by a glucometer. And at that point of time, the patient does not have to take treatment for hypoglycemia. He should not take glucose or something like that, but he should become aware that I am now at risk of hypoglycemia and I should try and correct and prevent whatever is causing this low blood glucose. So basically there are three levels of hypoglycemia in diabetes. Level 1 is the glucose alert value of 70. That is an alert value, as I said. It should prompt you to look at why the blood glucose is falling. Then level 2 is a glucose level less than 54, which is sufficiently low to indicate serious hypoglycemia. And even if no symptoms are there, it should be managed aggressively. And then severe hypoglycemia, which is any event which requires the assistance of another person to help administer carbohydrate or some other treatment or to resuscitate the patient. So these are the classifications. As I said, severe hypoglycemia is when you require another person to administer carbohydrate, and at that time plasma glucose measurement may not be available. Then there is something called documented symptomatic hypoglycemia, which means typical symptoms have occurred and the plasma glucose was less than 70. Something called asymptomatic hypoglycemia, which is no symptoms but with a measured plasma glucose less than 70. Then probable symptomatic hypoglycemia, in which symptoms are not accompanied by plasma glucose testing, but the symptoms were typical and it was believed that may have been caused by low blood glucose. And something called pseudo hypoglycemia, in which the patient has typical symptoms but the plasma glucose is more than 70, but it may be approaching that level. Pseudo hypoglycemia can occur in uncontrolled diabetics, and when they have very high blood glucose, when it becomes even into the normal range, they can feel symptoms of hypoglycemia, and that is called pseudo hypoglycemia. So there are several risk factors for hypoglycemia in a diabetic patient. Number one is insulin or insulin secretagogue. If the doses are too much, if they are given at the wrong time or of the wrong type, these can precipitate hypoglycemia. If you have a reduced exogenous glucose delivery, for example, you did not eat your food, or example, you did an overnight fast. If the glucose utilization was increased, for example, exercise. If endogenous glucose production was decreased, as seen in alcohol ingestion, or if the sensitivity to existing insulin was increased, which can be seen in patients who have had weight loss, who improved their fitness, or sometimes in the middle of the night. And even if your blood glucose was high earlier and now it has become normal, your sensitivity to insulin also goes up. So a patient who was taking 60 units to control blood glucose when the blood glucose was 400 may require only 30 units or 20 units once the blood glucose becomes normal. So the sensitivity can actually improve just by treating the diabetes itself, and that can also cause hypoglycemia. Then in renal failure, for example, insulin clearance from the body is reduced, and those patients can again get hypoglycemia. So insulin excess in diabetes will occur because of treatment by insulin or giving insulin secretagogues. Further, there is a defective glucose counter regulation in diabetes. In type 1 diabetes and in late stages of type 2, there may not be enough insulin secretion as it is, and therefore they may not be able to mount the first defense, that is a decrease in insulin secretion. So the first defense is lost. The second defense is increase in glucagon, but glucagon does not sense hypoglycemia, it senses a decrease in insulin levels. If the insulin levels themselves are very low or non-existent, then there will be no increase in glucagon secretion in hypoglycemia. So the second defense is lost. And the third defense, which is the epinephrine secretion, that is also attenuated or weakened in type 2 diabetes for reasons that are not very clear. But recurrent hypoglycemias, if they occur, they are known to worsen or reduce the epinephrine secretion even further. So in this way, even the third defense is lost. Further, there is something called hypoglycemia unawareness. This is now also called impaired awareness of hypoglycemia, because some people may feel some symptoms, some may not feel any symptoms at all. So this impaired awareness is because of reduced release of sympathetic neurotransmitters, and it occurs mainly when you have recurrent hypoglycemias, and therefore, and setting of recurrent hypoglycemia, patient will not secrete enough amounts of norepinephrine and acetylcholine, and therefore they will not feel the neurogenic symptoms. And this is very risky, because then the patient can go into a more severe form of hypoglycemia and straight away present with neuroglycopenic symptoms. And this reduction in secretion of acetylcholine and epinephrine is also referred to as hypoglycemia associated autonomic failure, or HAAF. So as you can see in the diagrams out here, in early type 2 diabetes, there is relative beta cell failure, but you can have isolated episodes of hypoglycemia. But in advanced type 2 diabetes and in type 1 diabetes, you have absolute beta cell failure. So even if you have a moderate increase in insulin levels, you will have falling glucose levels. There is beta cell failure, so there is no decrease in insulin and no increase in glucagon levels. And you will have episodes of hypoglycemia, which may be occurring even during exercise or at sleep. And this will cause an attenuated sympathoadrenal response to hypoglycemia, or HAAF. And this will result in defective glucose counterregulation and impaired awareness, causing recurrent hypoglycemia. And recurrent hypoglycemia will again cause further attenuation of the responses, and therefore this cycle will continue. So this HAAF has cardiovascular implications also. I can't get rid of this yellow box which is appearing on top of the screen. I don't know from where it has come. So I hope it will not intrude too much, because it is only at the top. So this HAAF has cardiovascular implications also, which is similar to autonomic neuropathy. But the good thing is that you can reverse HAAF. HAAF can reduce the baroreflex sensitivity, leading to postural hypotension, and it also predisposes to cardiac arrhythmias. However, avoiding hypoglycemia for 2 to 3 weeks can reverse this HAAF. Apart from hypoglycemia-induced HAAF, you can also have exercise-related HAAF, in which hypoglycemia occurs after exercise for prolonged periods. And you can also have sleep-related HAAF, in which hypoglycemia occurs during sleep. The risk factors for HAAF include absolute endogenous insulin deficiency, which is type 1 diabetes or late stages of type 2, any history of severe hypoglycemia or impaired awareness of hypoglycemia, or both, and thirdly, aggressive glycemic therapy with a lower HbA1c target. So we should try to reduce the risk factors first, and for doing that, number one, we should acknowledge the problem. Some patients may not volunteer to tell you about hypoglycemia, in which we have to actively ask them, and if they report any symptoms, we should not brush those symptoms aside. We should apply the principles of aggressive glycemic therapy when we are using it. We should go for patient education and empowerment. They should know how hypoglycemia occurs, how the drugs work, how to reduce insulin dose, etc. They should do frequent self-monitoring of blood glucose in order to detect hypoglycemia. Some of them can actually even benefit from continuous glucose monitoring. They should be given flexible and appropriate insulin regimens. Glycemic goals can be individualized. It can be a more aggressive goal for a younger patient with lower duration of diabetes, and a relaxed goal for somebody who's older. And ongoing professional guidance and support. And we should take care of the conventional risk factors for hypoglycemia, and also consider the risk factors for HAAF. Among insulins, you can have relatively less hypoglycemia if you use analogs such as Lispro and Aspart as compared to regular insulin. This is because they have a shorter duration of action. And among the longer acting insulins, earlier we used to use NPH, or some places still use NPH, which has a distinct peak, and it is a major cause of hypoglycemia. But Glargine does less hypoglycemia than NPH. And again, Glargine U100 is relatively more hypoglycemia as compared to Glargine U300, which is a more concentrated variant. And you also have Degludec, which has probably the least hypoglycemia among the longer acting insulins. So somebody who is having hypoglycemias will benefit from Glargine. And if he's having on Glargine, then we can move to Glargine U300 or even to Degludec. Among drugs, Hypoglycemia risk does not occur with metformin, SGLT2 inhibitors, thiazolidine that is the glitazones, alpha glucosidase inhibitors, GLP-1 agonists, and DPP-4 inhibitors, but only when they are used without insulin or insulin secretagogues. So if these drugs are used alone or in combination with themselves, they will not cause hypoglycemia. But if you are giving insulin or you are giving insulin secretagogues, then these will contribute to the hypoglycemia. They will increase the risk of hypoglycemia. Hypoglycemia is most likely with sulfonylureas. The most potent one is glibenclamide in terms of hypoglycemia, followed by glimepiride, followed by gliclazide, followed by the glinides, which are the shortest acting. Among these, glimepiride is the most commonly used drug and is the most common cause of severe hypoglycemia in our practice. Most of the admissions with OHA-induced hypoglycemias that you would have seen would always be glimepiride-induced, at least in our area. Now, HbA1c targets. In younger patients, it is a good idea to go for intensive glycemic control because intensive glycemic control will reduce microvascular complications significantly. However, the improvement in macrovascular complication is much less and not statistically significant as per the currently available data. So that attempt should be to achieve the lowest possible A1C without causing hypoglycemia. And although we generally use a target of 7 for most patients, target can be lowered, increased rather to 8.5 if the patient has HAF, history of severe hypoglycemia, if they have chronic kidney disease, if they have chronic vascular complications such as CAD and CVA, if they are having long duration of diabetes, or they have other comorbidities such as cancer, or they have short life expectancy for whatever reason, maybe old age or some other concurrent illness. In these patients, it is better to go for a relaxed target. Risk factor reduction we've already talked about. But we should always remember that an episode of severe hypoglycemia is a clinical red flag. And unless we can clearly tell what was the cause of hypoglycemia, we should prompt a consideration of the fundamental change in the therapeutic regimen. That is, that may be a complete removal of sulfonylureas from the regimen, or a complete change in the insulin regimen, so on and so forth. For impaired awareness of hypoglycemia, as we discussed, patient re-education and a 2 to 3 week period of scrupulous avoidance of hypoglycemia is required, and that will restore the hypoglycemia unawareness. So now we come to the treatment of hypoglycemia and diabetes. Most episodes can be treated by oral glucose or carbohydrates, and therefore we need not give parenteral therapy for all patients. Parenteral therapies should be reserved for only those who are unable or unwilling to take orally. This is a common error, especially in the wards. The moment hypoglycemia is detected, the first treatment order that is given is intravenous glucose. But you have to see whether the patient is conscious. If the patient is conscious and oriented and he is able to take orally, then the first treatment is oral glucose and not IV glucose. So how do you treat glucose? How much glucose will you give? 15 to 20 grams, that is 3 to 4 teaspoons of glucose has to be given orally. It can be glucose powder or glucose tablets. After giving glucose, blood glucose has to be checked after 15 minutes. Blood glucose should definitely be more than 70 milligrams per DL. If it is not, then we repeat the same dose and again check after 15 minutes. This treatment will correct the blood glucose temporarily, but the effect will last only 2 hours. And therefore, patient has to be given a snack or a meal or additional carbohydrate after this, after the blood glucose is corrected, to ensure that another hypoglycemia does not occur immediately. Now, glucose, we say glucose, but in the market, what is available mostly is Glucon-D. And interestingly, there are 2 Glucon-Ds in the market which are available. There may be more, I am aware of 2. One is the green Glucon-D, which is the regular, and you have the other orange one, which is probably orange flavor. So which glucose should the patient get? Can he get either? So you need to look at what is inside the box. So in the green one, you have glucose 99.4%, and basically there is no sucrose. And if you look at the orange one, you look out here, 56 grams of sucrose out of 100 grams. So more than half of this is sucrose. So what we want to give is glucose and not sucrose, and therefore we will not opt for the orange glucose. We will always ask the patient to get the green box. Can we use sugar? Can we use sweets or chocolates to treat hypoglycemia? If you can access glucose, then definitely you have to give glucose. If you cannot access glucose, then you can, as an emergency status, use some of these. But what you need to know, sugar is sucrose, which has to be digested first to fructose and glucose, and only then the glucose will enter the circulation and the blood glucose will rise. Further, sweets and chocolates have a lot of fats, and these fats will delay the absorption of carbohydrates, and it will take even longer for the blood glucose to move up. And this time spent in releasing glucose can be critical in some cases when the blood glucose is very low or falling rapidly. So patients should be educated. They should not use sweets and chocolates unless it is an emergency and they don't have glucose. Glucose tablets are also available, although they are not very popular. They are under the brand name of Hypotab, and one tablet is 4 grams. So at least 4 to 5 tablets have to be chewed to get a response. Now, parenteral therapy, one parenteral therapy which is not commonly used but very well used in the West is glucagon injections. 1 mg of glucagon given subcutaneous or IM, either by a pre-filled syringe or an assembly like shown in the picture. This is available even in India, but is expensive, around 1,000 rupees, and it is not very popular because patient relatives may not know how to use a syringe. And it will not work in alcohol-induced or starvation-related hypoglycemia, because what it does basically is it causes glycogenolysis as the immediate response, and that will occur only when you have insulin excess state. Then parenteral treatment, if the patient is not able to take orally and you don't have glucagon, you have to go for IV glucose. The dose is 25 grams, and even this dose is enough to cause hypoglycemia for most patients. So there is no need to go more than 25 grams. How do you give this? You should go for 50 ml of 50% dextrose. If that is not available, you can also use 25% dextrose 100 ml. But of course, if you give less volume, that will circulate more quickly. So it is better to give 50 ml of 50%. Both will contain the same amount, 25% of dextrose. And if your patient is not taking orally, even after the hypoglycemia is improved, then you may have to continue some IV fluid, maybe a 5% dextrose or a 10% dextrose. How long to treat the hypoglycemia? It is important to know that glimepiride can cause recurrent hypoglycemias up to 7 days, but maximum risk is in the first 24 to 48 hours. So if you find a patient who has come with OH-induced hypoglycemia, patient is unconscious, and you manage to revive the patient, you should not send him back home the same day. At least observe him for 2 days, and with advice to be carefully observant for the next 5 days at home also. And this is especially true if the patient has renal failure or reduced GFR. And it is important to know that elderly patients who have a normal looking creatinine have a low GFR, because GFR depends upon the age also. And therefore, these patients are predisposed to recurrent hypoglycemias from glimepiride. With insulins, the hypoglycemia will last for a few hours depending upon the type of insulin that has been used. When the patient is not on an insulin regimen, a frequently asked question in the wards and sometimes at home also is that if the patient gets a hypoglycemia just before the next meal bolus, what is to be done? So as you can see in this blood glucose chart, which also mentions the insulin doses, on the 2nd of August, in the just before dinner, the blood glucose was 66. Now the question is, should we give the dinner bolus? Should we omit the bolus? So the answer is no, you should not omit the bolus. The hypoglycemia which has occurred out here is probably a result of either a high lunch dose, because you can see on the 1st of August also, the before lunch blood glucose was 160 and the before dinner value fell to 84. So probably this dose of R6 here was too much. The other thing could be that maybe the patient took even less food on the 2nd day and lunchtime, or did not take the evening snack. And these are the reasons why this hypoglycemia has occurred. So you will try to find out the reason, and then accordingly either lower this R6 to R4, or you will ask the patient to take a consistent amount of food in the lunch. But if you do not give the insulin out here, you will get a very marked hyperglycemia post dinner, because already after 84, the post dinner value previous day was 170. So if you don't give insulin out here, it will shoot to 200, 300, and that will cause unnecessary hyperglycemia. So what you do at 66, you first correct the hypoglycemia. If the patient has symptoms, you give him glucose, and once the blood glucose has become normal, then you give him the dinner bolus and the meal as usual, and on the next day you intervene and take the other actions. So you need not omit that bolus, because that bolus is not the cause of hypoglycemia. So I think I will stop here because we are running out of time, and I have just a few more slides on hypoglycemia without diabetes, and that we will do in the next session. So now we will discuss hypoglycemia in patients without diabetes. So hypoglycemia in patients without diabetes is very uncommon, and it is often misdiagnosed or overdiagnosed rather. First of all, you need to have low venous blood glucose values to diagnose hypoglycemia. You cannot use glucometer values. Second, even if you have a blood glucose value, it could be pseudohypoglycemia. That is, you can have a vial did not have sodium fluoride, so there was no inhibition of the metabolism of glucose in the red cells, and that can cause a lowering of the blood glucose. Further, even if you have a fluoride vial and you have a delay in the sample processing, the cells in the blood will use up glucose and you will get a low value. Further, in fasting state, children and pregnant women can sometimes get low values, which is normal, and that is probably because of brain is using ketones or some other metabolites at that point of time. So you should evaluate such patients for hypoglycemia only when the Whipple's triad is categorically fulfilled. That is, all three components are clearly available to you. You should not embark on a detailed evaluation if that is not there, because it is usually unfruitful. So again, we revisit the causes of hypoglycemia. Now we have already discussed diabetes. So broadly, it is either the patient is ill or medicated, or the other, which is the patient is seemingly well. So among the ill patients, apart from insulin secretagogues, alcohol is one important cause of hypoglycemia. So alcohol reduces the synthesis of glucose, also reduces the appetite of people. Chronic alcoholics eat very little. They will have very little glycogen reserves in the liver, and they will also produce much less glucose during gluconeogenesis. And then there are drugs which can precipitate hypoglycemia. The list is out here. Among these important ones are gatafloxacin, quinine, which we do not use anymore. Glucagon, which is sometimes used for some other reasons, can also cause hypoglycemia also. Then you have artesunate and artemisinin. These can also cause hypoglycemia. The lithium, and then very rarely the ACE inhibitors, levofloxacin, they also have been reported to cause hypoglycemia. So when hypoglycemia occurs in the hospital, look at the drugs which the patient is getting. Are any of the drugs from this list? Then critical illnesses will cause hypoglycemia. Liver, as you know, is the main source for glycogenolysis and gluconeogenesis. So if you have hepatic failure, hypoglycemia is likely to occur. In renal failure, again, reduced clearance of insulin occurs, and that can again cause hypoglycemia. And cardiac failure has also been associated with hypoglycemia, causes of which are little unclear. In sepsis, again, because of increased uptake of insulin in different tissues and by the white blood cells, there can be a decrement in the blood glucose value, and sepsis is one very common cause of hypoglycemia. And chronic malnutrition or prolonged fasting, starvation can also manifest hypoglycemia. Apart from that, hormone deficiencies such as cortisol and glucagon deficiency can cause hypoglycemias in children most likely, but in adults it is rare. However, if a person who is deficient in cortisol and encounters a critical illness, then the two together can precipitate hypoglycemia. And there can be some non-islet cell tumors, especially some mesenchymal tumors, which produce IGF-2 and IGF-1. So these insulin-like growth factors have insulin-like actions, and they can also cause hypoglycemia. Now, but when we talk about a seemingly well individual, that is a patient who doesn't have any other disease and who says, I don't take any medications, and who lands up with hypoglycemia, that is the person in which more evaluation is warranted. Among these, most of the cases that you will see probably will either be accidental or surreptitious or malicious hypoglycemia. It is important to look at the profession of the person. If he is a doctor, he is a staff nurse or a pharmacist by profession, then there are chances that he may have procured the drugs and may have taken for some other reasons. If the patient has a family history of diabetes, and that means there is somebody at home who has the drugs, then that is again a red flag. And in such patients, it is best to perform a circumlinear screen in the 24 hours after they've had an episode of hypoglycemia, and you can easily pick up that misuse of the drug. However, if they are misusing insulin, then it becomes very difficult to detect. And I have seen one patient who was using insulin, and he was evaluated in detail for everything, including uh, imaging for insulinomas, but actually he was misusing insulin. Then if you have ruled out the above category, then what is left is endogenous hyperinsulinism, that is hypoglycemia because of excess insulin secretion from within. Among these insulinomas, very rare tumors, it is very easy for people to make a diagnosis of insulinoma, but actually insulinomas are very rare, and outside of endocrine practice, most people do not see insulinomas in their lifetime. So it is that rare. Acidoblastosis is when the entire pancreas is secreting insulin without a proper feedback inhibition, and that is even more rare. And there is also something called non-insulinoma pancreatic hypoglycemia syndrome, which is again very, very rare, and it is sometimes confused with acidoblastosis. Then something which may now become common is a post-gastric bypass hypoglycemia. We are getting quite a few patients with bariatric surgery, although more likely to be getting gastric resection rather than Roux-en-Y. But if you have a Roux-en-Y gastric bypass, you can have a rapid delivery of glucose into the distal intestine, and that can cause a very dramatic GLP response leading to hypoglycemic symptoms. And there is also something called autoimmune hypoglycemia, in which you have antibody to insulin, and this antibody binds all the insulin in the blood, and then it releases this insulin gradually at different points of time, and thus causing hypoglycemia. And one particular thing about autoimmune hypoglycemia is that you see very, very high insulin levels. It's in thousands. Just for reference, the normal fasting insulin is supposed to be less than 5 microunits per ml, but you can have postprandial levels can vary depending upon the insulin resistance and the kind of food is taken, for example. But generally, it is the range 5 to 20 sort of range for the insulin is common. But if you have insulin level in thousands, you should think of autoimmune hypoglycemia. Insulinomas, again, level is not very high. It is actually within normal, but I will tell you what happens in insulinoma. So how to evaluate? You take a careful history and examination to exclude all the causes that were mentioned in the previous slides. It is important not to order a fasting insulin or a random insulin or C-peptide in these patients, because except for insulin autoimmune syndrome, which I mentioned, these values are never high even in insulinoma. So you cannot make any diagnosis from looking at a random insulin levels in a patient who had hypoglycemia at some point of time. So what you need to do is you need to look at these hormones when the patient is having the episode of hypoglycemia. So what you need to do, you have to get a insulin value less than or greater than 3 microunits per ml, C-peptide greater than 0.6 nanogram per ml, and plasma proinsulin more than 5 picomole per liter when the plasma glucose is less than 55 milligram per dl, that too by a lab sample, venous plasma glucose, not a glucometer value, along with symptoms of hypoglycemia. So this sampling has to be done when the patient is undergoing that hypoglycemia, not after he has recovered. After that, this test has no value. So if you can find patient having spontaneous hypoglycemia in front of you, then you collect the sample for all these three. And what you will do is you will take a sample for the hormones, you will take another sample for glucose. You may have checked the blood glucose by a glucometer alone, but you have to reconfirm it by sending the same sample to the lab. And when that sample comes out to be less than 55, then you can ask for the other sample to be processed for the hormone levels. And then sense can be made out of it. The patient may say that I'm having hypoglycemias at home, but I don't have right now. And if such patient has been having predominantly fasting hypoglycemias, which is typical for insulinomas, then you go for a 72-hour fast. So what you do in that fast is you admit the patient, and we actually do this in our department. We admit the patient, and then we put them on glucose monitoring along with monitoring of the ketones. Either blood ketone or urine ketone will do. Hourly blood glucose monitoring is done. Patient can drink clear water, but is not allowed to eat anything, and we'll monitor for a hypoglycemia episode. When we get a hypoglycemia episode, we draw the samples, and after that, if we get the clearly low blood glucose value, we terminate the fast. But let's say the patient does not get any hypoglycemia in the 72 hours, then the fast is terminated and it is considered to be in negative fast. Or if before 72 hours, there is an increase in ketone levels. So as you know, insulin suppresses ketone production completely, and a rise in ketone levels indicates that there is no underlying hyperinsulinism at all. So if you get a high ketone in a patient who has been saying I am having hypoglycemia, then you can be sure that this patient has not got endogenous hyperinsulinism. This patient does not have insulinoma or acidoblastosis, etc., any of those things. This is how briefly how we do the fast in a department. There is a proper protocol. Somebody of you who have been posted out there might have actually witnessed the fast also. Then some patients may say that they have only postprandial symptoms, and commonly these patients are obese and they may have underlying prediabetes, and this is what happens in such patients. So there are two phases of insulin secretion. There is a phase 1 and there is a phase 2. So the phase 1 is release of preformed insulin, and that occurs immediately after eating food. So as you see in the diagram, the black line is the normal person, and you see just at 0 minutes, just up immediately at 0 minutes, the food has been taken. Just after the 0 minutes, there is immediately a spike. It is within 1 minute or 2 minutes, the spike occurs in the insulin levels. And then gradually later on, more insulin is synthesized later on. This is the second peak. So this is the second phase. So this peak is first phase, and the second smaller peak is the second phase. In type 2 diabetes, the typical manifestation in early disease is loss of first phase. It is called loss of first phase insulin response. So as you can see in the purple line, there is no peak at the time when you should have a first phase response. And then later on, you get a more pronounced peak, which is called exaggerated second phase response. So type 2 diabetes has loss of first phase and exaggeration of second phase response. So in such patients, what we do, we ask for a mixed meal test. Earlier, we used to do extended OGTT, but now guidelines says that you should go for mixed meal test. Mixed meal test is basically you tell the patient to eat the same food with which they are having hypoglycemia at home. They bring the food from their home, whatever food it is, they eat that item, whether paratha, dal, sabzi, whatever it is, they will eat that, and then we will monitor the blood glucose, insulin, and C-peptide hourly for next 4 to 5 hours. This is how the table will look like. This patient, fasting glucose 126, so already he almost had diabetes. It's very close to the cutoff, almost at the cutoff rather. Then the blood glucose shot to 257, and you watch what the insulin does. Insulin rose to 93, but actually the insulin should have risen early at within 2-3 minutes, not at 1 hour, and by that time this peak would not have occurred. In a normal person, it would not have gone that high. So the first phase did not occur, and now the second phase, exaggerated second phase, is coming forward. So blood glucose has given to 257, insulin has risen to 93. Then blood glucose is now beginning to fall, but the exaggerated second phase is still continuing. Insulin is not falling that fast. It is still 49. And then the patient goes into hypoglycemia. You get a 54. Insulin levels are coming down, but they have still not caught up with the glucose. And then at 4 hours, finally, the insulin levels become low and the blood glucose recovers. And this is the time when the patient gets the symptoms. So this is typical of what was early called reactive hypoglycemia. And this is seen in patients who are progressing to diabetes from prediabetes. And generally it is benign in that sense that it can be managed by reducing the weight, doing more exercise, or giving meals which have a more prolonged absorption, etc. But the flip side is that such patients are likely to go into diabetes very soon. They have already lost the first phase. So they're going to come up with diabetes in the near future. So we have done extended OGTT also. I think some of you might have actually done that with us. Now, if you confirm endogenous hyperinsulinism by the above, that is, you did the fast or you did the your spontaneous hypoglycemia with high insulin values, relatively high insulin values, then you go for imaging for the insulinoma, typically a CCT abdomen, in which it is important to get the early arterial phase images. If you do a routine CT abdomen, you are going to miss it. You need to have the very early arterial phase images, which normally are not taken. Then you can also do an MRI abdomen if it is a very prominent lesion. Endoscopic ultrasonography has very good detection technique for insulinomas. And there are some newer PET CTs with some new modalities such as GLP based PET CTs, which are showing promise for picking up insulinomas. But insulinomas are a challenge to localize, even and they are a challenge to diagnose also, but they are even bigger challenges to localize for most patients. Treatment wise, you have to be give the specific treatment for insulinoma. The treatment is of course resection of the tumor. In acidoblastosis, you may have to do a partial pancreatectomy. And then, for example, in autoimmune syndrome, insulin autoimmune syndrome, sometimes it is because of drugs. You can withdraw the drug and it recovers on its own. And some people have tried giving steroids, etc., to treat it. And of course, then if you have a drug intake, you can reduce that drug, and then you can treat your renal failure, etc., etc. So those are the specific treatments. So that is about hypoglycemia. And now I will stop the presentation, and we can go ahead.